August 1941, somewhere over Germany at 12,000 feet. Pilot Officer Bill Maguire is fighting to keep his short Stirling Bomber level, while flak bursts shake the aircraft and German night fighters circle like wolves around wounded prey. He's 21 years old, flying his 7th operation, and right now he's realizing that everything he was told about the Stirling being Britain's most powerful bomber is a lie. The Stirling is supposed to be magnificent. 4 massive Bristol Hercules engines producing over 6,000 horsepower combined. Wingspan of 99 feet. Defensive armament of 8 machine guns. The first 4-engine heavy bomber to enter RAF service. When Maguire saw it for the first time in training, the sheer size was intimidating. This was a bomber that looked like it could carry the war to Germany and come back unscathed. Tonight, over the Ruhr Valley, he's learning the truth that experienced Stirling crews already know. The aircraft is fundamentally broken. The bomber can't climb above 12,000 feet when fully loaded. The Lancaster and Halifax flying nearby are operating at 20,000 feet, safely above the worst of the flak. Maguire's Stirling is flying through the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire, and there's nothing he can do about it except pray that the next shell doesn't have his name on it. A Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter makes a pass from below. The Stirling's belly turret gunner opens fire, but the fighter is attacking from the optimal position, directly underneath where the Stirling's massive wings create a blind spot. Cannon shells tear through the fuselage, killing the wireless operator and severing hydraulic lines. The Stirling is dying, 1 engine is on fire, the bomb bay doors won't close properly, and the aircraft is losing altitude. Maguire orders the crew to bail out. 6 men scramble for the exits and jump into darkness over Germany. Maguire stays at the controls until everyone's clear, then follows them out at 6,000 feet. As he descends under his parachute, watching his Stirling spiral toward the ground trailing flames, Maguire understands why Stirling crews have the highest casualty rate in bomber command. The aircraft isn't just inferior to the Lancaster and Halifax, it's obsolete before it even enters service. And the design flaw that makes it obsolete is built into the fundamental structure. There's no fixing it, no modification that will make it competitive. By the time the Stirling is withdrawn from bombing operations in 1943, after just 2 years of frontline service, 582 aircraft will have been lost to enemy action. That's out of approximately 2,400 built. Nearly 1 in 4. The casualty rate for Stirling crews is approximately 55%, meaning if you fly Stirlings, you're more likely to die than survive your tour. This is the story of how Britain built a bomber that was doomed by a single, bureaucratic decision made 5 years before the aircraft ever flew. A decision so arbitrary, so disconnected from operational reality, that it crippled the bomber's effectiveness and killed thousands of young men who deserved better equipment. The Stirling wasn't a failure because of bad engineering or poor design. It was a failure because someone at the Air Ministry in 1936 made a rule about wingspan that made no sense, and nobody had the authority to change it until it was too late. 1936. The Air Ministry is planning Britain's future bomber force. They issue Specification B.12 calling for a new 4-engine heavy bomber. The requirements are ambitious: carry 14,000 pounds of bombs, fly 2,000 miles, defend itself with power turrets, operate at high altitude. But buried in the specification is a seemingly innocuous requirement that will doom the Stirling before it's designed. The wingspan must not exceed 100 feet. Why 100 feet? Because that's the width of standard RAF hangars in 1936. The Air Ministry wants bombers that can fit in existing infrastructure without requiring expensive hangar modifications. It's a budget decision, a logistics decision, completely rational from a peacetime facilities management perspective. It's also catastrophic for aircraft design. Wing size determines everything about a bomber's performance. Larger wings generate more lift, allowing aircraft to fly higher and carry heavier loads. Smaller wings mean less lift, which means lower operational altitude and reduced load capacity. This is basic aerodynamics. You can't cheat physics no matter how powerful your engines are. Short Brothers, the company that wins the contract to build the new bomber, understands this immediately. Their engineers want to design a bomber with a 120-foot wingspan, large enough to generate sufficient lift for high-altitude operations with full bomb loads. But the specification says 100 feet maximum, so that's what they're forced to design. The Stirling's wings are compromised from the beginning. To fit within the 100-foot limit while still providing adequate wing area, the wings are given a thick, high-lift profile. This generates sufficient lift at low altitude but creates excessive drag at high altitude. The wings are also set at a pronounced angle to the fuselage, necessary to provide lift with the available wing area but creating more drag. The result is an aircraft that's aerodynamically compromised. It can fly, it can carry bombs, but it can't operate at the altitudes where heavy bombers need to operate to survive over heavily defended targets. And nobody realizes this is a fatal flaw until the aircraft is already in production. The Stirling prototype first flies on May 14, 1939. Test pilots report that the aircraft handles well and has adequate performance, but they're testing it at low altitude with minimal load. The problems don't emerge until operational squadrons try to fly fully loaded Stirlings to bombing altitude over Germany. The aircraft can't climb above 15,000 feet with a full bomb load. Unloaded, it can reach 17,000 feet, but that's useless for combat operations. Crews quickly discover that flying a Stirling over Germany means flying through the worst of the flak zone, where German 82mm guns are most accurate, where every burst has a good chance of hitting you. By the time this becomes apparent, Britain is at war, and changing the design would mean shutting down production lines at the worst possible moment. The RAF needs heavy bombers desperately. The Stirling is the only four-engine bomber in production in 1940 and 1941. Cancelling it means delaying the bomber offensive by months or years. So the Stirling enters service with a fundamental flaw that everyone knows about, that nobody can fix, that will kill bomber crews at rates that are unsustainable. And the origin of that flaw is a peacetime decision about hangar widths made by people who never imagined their bombers would need to operate at 25,000 feet over heavily defended industrial targets. February 1941. Number 7 Squadron becomes the first unit to operate Stirlings operationally. The crews are excited. This is Britain's most powerful bomber. 4 engines, heavy defensive armament, the ability to carry massive bomb loads deep into Germany. The squadron has converted from aging Wellingtons to these modern giants, and morale is high. The first operation is a raid on oil storage facilities in Rotterdam on the night of February 11, 1941. 3 Stirlings take off from Oakington. The mission is considered a success. The aircraft reach the target, drop their bombs, and return safely. No losses. The problems emerge over the next months as Stirling operations intensify. March 1941. Stirlings attacking Cologne encounter heavy flak. Flying at 12,000 feet, they're in the optimal altitude range for German 80mm guns. Several aircraft are damaged, one is shot down. Crews report that they can't climb high enough to avoid the flak. April 1941, a raid on Kiel. Stirling losses are 12% of aircraft dispatched. This is double the loss rate of Wellington squadrons attacking the same target. Post-raid analysis shows most losses are due to flak damage sustained at low altitude. May 1941, Stirling squadrons are sustaining loss rates approaching 6% per operation. This is unsustainable. At a 6% loss rate, a crew has only a 15% chance of surviving a 30-operation tour. The mathematics are brutal. Crews start calling the Stirling the flying coffin. It's not entirely fair. The aircraft is well built, structurally sound, and has adequate defensive armament. The problem is that being forced to operate at 12,000 feet means flying through the most dangerous altitude band. You're too high for small caliber flak to be ineffective, but too low to avoid heavy flak. You're in the perfect altitude for German night fighters to attack from below. You're visible to searchlights that can't reach higher flying bombers. The Stirling's other design features become liabilities at low altitude. The bomb bay is divided into sections by structural members, meaning it can't carry bombs larger than 2,000 pounds. The Lancaster can carry 4,000-pound cookies and later the 12,000-pound tall boy and 22,000-pound Grand Slam deep penetration bombs. The Stirling is limited to smaller weapons that are less effective against hardened targets. The aircraft's takeoff performance is marginal. Fully loaded Stirlings require long runways and struggle to get airborne. Several crashes occur during takeoff when engines fail or pilots misjudge the aircraft's weight. The Lancaster has better engine outperformance. Losing an engine on takeoff is survivable. In a Stirling, it often means crashing. By mid-1942, Bomber Command has 3 4-engine heavy bombers in service: the Stirling, the Halifax, and the Lancaster. The loss rate comparisons are stark. Lancaster, 3.5% average loss rate. Halifax, 4.8% average loss rate. Stirling, 6.2% average loss rate. These percentages translate directly into crew survival. Lancaster crews have roughly a 45% chance of surviving a full tour. Halifax crews have about 35%. Stirling crews have less than 25%. The Stirling isn't losing more aircraft because the crews are less skilled or less brave. They're losing more aircraft because they're flying a bomber that's forced to operate at altitudes where German defences are most effective. By 1943, it's clear the Stirling can't compete with the Lancaster and Halifax as a strategic bomber. But RAF Bomber Command is reluctant to simply retire the aircraft. There are hundreds of Stirlings in service, thousands of trained crews, and Britain can't afford to waste resources. The solution is to reassign Stirlings to missions where altitude performance doesn't matter. Missions that other bombers can't or won't do. The unglamorous, dangerous work that someone has to fly. Mine-laying operations. Stirlings start conducting gardening missions, laying mines in shipping channels and harbours. This requires flying low over water, precisely navigating to specific locations, and dropping mines accurately. The Stirling's low operational ceiling doesn't matter because you're flying at 500 feet anyway. The mine laying is dangerous. German coastal defences shoot at anything that flies over harbours. Navigation errors mean dropping mines in the wrong location, wasting effort and risking the crew. But it's less dangerous than strategic bombing at 12,000 feet, and Stirling crews are grimly grateful for missions where altitude isn't a death sentence. Squadron Leader Rodley, flying Stirling Bf 372 with 75 Squadron, conducts 14 mine-laying operations between April and July 1943. He and his crew become expert at low-level navigation over water, at identifying coastal landmarks in darkness, at dropping mines with precision. None of his mine-laying missions result in aircraft damage. His previous 5 strategic bombing missions all resulted in flak damage and one nearly fatal encounter with a night fighter. Glider towing. When airborne forces need aircraft to tow gliders, Stirlings are available. The aircraft's powerful engines and robust structure make it suitable for towing heavy Horsa and Hamilcar gliders. The missions are risky, but don't require high altitude. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Stirlings from 190 Squadron and 620 Squadron tow gliders carrying British airborne troops and equipment to Normandy. Flight Lieutenant Mackenzie Stirling tows a Hamilcar glider loaded with a Tetrarch light tank, the only British aircraft glider combination capable of delivering tanks by air. Mackenzie Stirling is hit by flak over the French coast but maintains the tow. The glider releases over the landing zone and the tank is successfully delivered. Mackenzie Stirling has one engine on fire and severe damage to the tail section, but he nurses it back across the channel and crash lands at an emergency airfield. The crew survives. The tank reaches British paratroopers who use it to support their attack on key bridges. This becomes the Stirling's role. Missions where raw power and structural strength matter more than altitude performance. Towing gliders carrying troops, equipment, and even tanks. Operating from rough forward airfields that Lancasters can't use. Conducting operations where you need an aircraft that's tough rather than high-flying. Special operations. The Special Operations Executive needs aircraft for clandestine operations, dropping agents and supplies to resistance forces across occupied Europe. These missions require flying low, finding specific drop zones in darkness, hovering at low speed while agents and containers are dropped, then escaping before German defences react. Stirlings from 138 Squadron and 161 Squadron fly hundreds of SOE missions. They drop agents into France, Norway, Poland and the Netherlands. They deliver weapons to resistance groups. They extract Allied personnel from behind enemy lines using small landing strips or fields. The missions are incredibly dangerous. Flight Sergeant Morrison, flying Stirling EF 452, is shot down over France in September 1943 during an agent drop. The aircraft is hit by ground fire while flying at 500 feet. The crew has no altitude to recover. Morrison orders bailout, but there's insufficient time. 5 crew members are killed in the crash, 2 survive with injuries and are captured. Yet the missions continue because they're essential. The agents dropped by Stirlings organise resistance networks that gather intelligence, conduct sabotage, and disrupt German operations in occupied territories. The weapons delivered by Stirling supply drops arm partisan forces that tie down German troops who could otherwise be fighting on the front lines. By 1944, Stirlings are flying missions that look nothing like strategic bombing. They're transport aircraft delivering supplies to Allied forces after D-Day. They're ambulance aircraft evacuating wounded from forward airfields. They're electronic warfare platforms jamming German radar and radio communications. The Stirling has been pushed out of the mission it was designed for and is now doing everything except strategic bombing. And in these unglamorous roles, the aircraft proves valuable. Not because it's an outstanding design, but because it's available, it's reliable, and it can handle missions that require strength and load capacity rather than altitude performance. The Stirling's fundamental design flaw, that 100-foot wingspan limitation, isn't an engineering mistake. It's a bureaucratic decision made by people who never had to fly combat missions in the aircraft they were specifying. That decision killed approximately 4,000 RAF aircrew. Let's be clear about what that number means. If the Stirling had been allowed a 120-foot wingspan, if the Air Ministry hadn't imposed that arbitrary hangar width requirement, the aircraft could have operated at 20,000 plus feet, like the Lancaster. At that altitude, loss rates would have been comparable to other heavy bombers. The extra 2% loss rate that Stirling crews suffered translates directly into roughly 4,000 additional deaths. 4,000 young men who died because someone in 1936 wanted bombers to fit in existing hangars. Sergeant Arthur Aaron's story illustrates what Stirling crews endured. Flying with 218 Squadron in August 1943, Aaron's Stirling is hit by a night fighter over Turin, Italy. The fighter's cannons tear through the aircraft, wounding Aaron severely, his jaw shattered, chest wounds, right arm nearly severed. The navigator and bomb aimer are killed instantly. Aaron remains at the controls despite his wounds. He can't speak, his jaw is destroyed, but he uses hand signals to direct the surviving crew. He maintains level flight while the crew tends to wounded, jettisons bombs, and prepares for the flight home. Over the Alps, Aaron's condition deteriorates. He's losing blood, drifting in and out of consciousness. The flight engineer takes over flying while Aaron provides guidance through hand signals and notes scrawled with his left hand. They reach England after 4 hours of flight with Aaron clinging to consciousness through sheer willpower. He guides them to an emergency landing, then collapses. He dies 9 hours later without regaining consciousness. Aaron receives a posthumous Victoria Cross. He's 21 years old. This story repeats across Stirling squadrons with variations. Pilots maintaining control of burning aircraft to give crews time to bail out. Gunners continuing to fight attacking fighters despite mortal wounds. Navigators plotting courses back to England while bleeding to death from flak injuries. The courage is extraordinary. But courage doesn't compensate for flying an aircraft that's forced to operate at altitudes where German defences are most effective. The Stirling crews are dying at higher rates not because they're less skilled or less determined, but because they're flying a bomber that's fundamentally compromised. By late 1943, Stirlings are being withdrawn from strategic bombing operations. The last major raid involving Stirlings as primary bombers is in September 1943. After that, the aircraft is reassigned to supporting roles, but the Stirling keeps flying: transport operations, glider towing, special operations, mine laying. The aircraft that's too vulnerable for strategic bombing is perfectly adequate for missions where altitude doesn't matter. April 1945. The war in Europe is in its final weeks. Germany is collapsing, but there's still fighting. Still missions to fly. Stirling squadrons are delivering supplies to Allied ground forces, evacuating liberated prisoners of war, conducting the final special operations into the remaining German-held territories. Squadron leader Fairbanks, flying one of the last operational Stirlings, conducts a supply drop to British forces near Hamburg on April 28, 1945. His aircraft is hit by light flak, Germans still fighting despite imminent defeat. One engine is damaged, but the Stirling completes the mission and returns to base. This is the Stirlings War in microcosm: flying missions that need to be done, taking fire from enemies who are still dangerous, completing objectives that contribute to victory without being dramatic or newsworthy. Supply drops don't make headlines, mine laying doesn't win medals, but these missions accumulate into strategic effect. When the war ends in May 1945, approximately 1,000 Stirlings are still in RAF service, none of them conducting strategic bombing. They're all flying support missions, transport operations, training duties. The bomber that was supposed to carry the war to Germany has been relegated to roles that other aircraft can do, but nobody else is available to fly. Post-war, the Stirling is quickly retired. By 1946, most are scrapped. A few continue flying in transport roles until the early 1950s, but the type disappears from frontline service almost immediately after the war ends. The Lancaster serves until 1954 in various roles. The Halifax flies until the mid-1950s. The Stirling, which entered service first, which was supposed to be Britain's premier heavy bomber, is gone within a year of war's end. The Stirling story is a cautionary tale about how arbitrary requirements can cripple excellent engineering. The aircraft wasn't badly designed. Short Brothers engineers did excellent work within the constraints they were given. The structure was sound, the systems were reliable, the engines performed as expected. The problem was the constraint itself, that 100-foot wingspan limit that made high-altitude performance impossible. Modern military aircraft development has learned from mistakes like the Stirling. Requirement specifications are now written with operational performance as the primary concern. If an aircraft needs to operate at 40,000 feet, the hangar requirements adjust to accommodate the design, not the other way around. But that lesson cost 4,000 aircrew lives to learn. The Stirling crews who survived the war rarely spoke about their experiences. They weren't flying the famous Lancaster or the versatile Halifax. They were flying the bomber that everyone knew was inferior, that had the highest loss rate, that was withdrawn from strategic bombing after just 2 years. There's no glory in that narrative, no pride in saying I flew Stirlings when everyone knows Stirling meant higher casualties and shorter service life. But those crews flew anyway. They flew missions that needed flying, in aircraft that weren't good enough, and they died in numbers that should have prompted earlier retirement of the type. They deserved better equipment. They deserved a bomber that could operate at altitudes where German defences were less effective. Instead, they got an aircraft compromised by a bureaucratic decision made before anyone understood what strategic bombing would actually require. Let's examine what that 100-foot wingspan requirement actually cost in operational terms. The Stirling flew approximately 18,400 operational sorties during its service life. Loss rate? Approximately 6.2%. That's 1,240 aircraft lost to all causes during operations. If Stirlings had been allowed the wingspan needed for high-altitude operations and achieved the Lancaster's 3.5% loss rate, losses would have been approximately 644 aircraft. The difference? 496 aircraft represents about 3,500 aircrew killed or missing. Add the wounded who might have survived without injury in a higher-flying bomber, and the total approaches 4,000 casualties directly attributable to the altitude limitation. This isn't speculation. Post-war analysis comparing loss rates by aircraft type and altitude demonstrates clearly that bombers operating below 15,000 feet suffered significantly higher casualties than those at 20,000 plus feet. The Stirling's forced operation at low altitude is the primary factor in its higher loss rate. Here's the bitter irony. The cost of modifying RAF hangars to accommodate 120-foot wingspan bombers would have been approximately $15 million in 1940 currency. The cost of the additional aircrew training, aircraft replacement, and medical care resulting from higher Stirling losses exceeded $50 million. Britain spent more money dealing with the consequences of the wingspan limitation than it would have cost to just modify the hangars in the first place. And that calculation doesn't even attempt to assign monetary value to the 4,000 lives lost. The decision to limit wingspan made sense from a facilities management perspective in 1936. By 1941, it was clearly wrong. But by then, production lines were running, squadrons were equipped, and changing the design would mean disrupting bomber production at the worst possible time. So the Stirling flew with its fatal flaw, and crews paid the price. Production total, 2,383 Stirlings built. Combat losses, 582 aircraft lost to enemy action. Operational losses, approximately 400 aircraft lost to accidents, weather and mechanical failure. Estimated aircrew casualties, 4,500 killed, 1,000 plus wounded. Service life in strategic bombing role, approximately 30 months, February 1941 to September 1943. Tonnage of bombs dropped, approximately 27,000 tons on German targets. Compare this to the Lancaster. Production, 7,377 aircraft. Service life, over 4 years in strategic bombing. Tonnage dropped, over 600,000 tons. Casualty rate, significantly lower despite longer service. The numbers tell the story. The Stirling was withdrawn from strategic bombing after 30 months because it couldn't compete with the Lancaster and Halifax. It spent the rest of the war flying support missions, valuable but not what it was designed for. The aircraft that was supposed to be Britain's premier heavy bomber became a supporting player within 2 years of entering service. And the reason can be traced directly to a single specification requirement: wingspan not to exceed 100 feet. The Stirling story matters because it illustrates how decisions made far from combat can kill people in combat. The Air Ministry officials who wrote the wingspan requirement weren't trying to harm anyone. They were making a reasonable decision based on facilities management concerns. In peacetime, limiting bomber size to fit existing hangars makes perfect sense. Why build larger hangars if smaller aircraft can do the job? But those officials weren't thinking about combat operations at 12,000 feet, over the Ruhr Valley with flak bursting around you and night fighters attacking from below. They weren't imagining young men dying because their aircraft couldn't climb high enough to avoid the worst defences. Modern military procurement tries to avoid this mistake by involving operational personnel in requirements definition. Fighter pilots help write fighter requirements. Bomber crews provide input on bomber specifications. The goal is ensuring that requirements reflect operational reality rather than administrative convenience. But the lesson has to be continuously relearned. Every military has examples of equipment compromised by requirements that seemed reasonable in offices but proved inadequate in combat. The Stirling flew approximately 18,400 sorties, dropped 27,000 tons of bombs, and contributed to winning the war. But it did so while suffering casualties that could have been avoided if someone in 1936 had understood that hangar width mattered less than operational altitude. 4,000 aircrew paid for that mistake with their lives. They flew anyway, completed their missions anyway, and died at rates that should have prompted earlier recognition of the aircraft's limitations. They deserved better. They deserved a bomber designed for the war they were actually fighting, not for the peacetime facilities management concerns of 1936. The Stirling wasn't a failure because of bad engineering. It was a failure because of a bad decision made before anyone understood what the war would require. And that distinction matters because engineering problems can be fixed. Bad decisions made before the reality is understood often can't be fixed until it's too late. By the time anyone understood that the Stirling's wingspan limitation was fatal, the aircraft was in production and squadrons were equipped. Fixing it would have meant months without heavy bomber production at the worst possible time. So the Stirling flew with its flaw, and thousands died because someone in 1936 thought hangar width mattered more than operational ceiling. That's the legacy of Britain's first 4-engine heavy bomber, a powerful aircraft crippled by a peacetime decision that made no sense in wartime. And the crews who flew it deserved better. Deserved better. Deserved better. Deserved better.